Okay, then let's go ahead with our next talk. And this talk is going to be about open source. What does that? Don't make me laugh. Cafe Quarta. I heard about it. Anyways, so the talk is going to be about open source. We all work for companies that are using on a daily basis open source. Ruby is open source. Rails is open source. We have plenty of other tools that are open source out there. And sometimes the fact that companies do support open source can become a double-edged sword. One sword, not too many. So there are issues also with companies actually trying to contribute back in the open source world. Floor today is gonna talk about a different license than the one we have heard until now, and it's called Hippocratic license, if I'm not mistaken with the English pronunciation of this. Hello, Floor.
Well
nice
done.
to see you.
Nice to see you.
Finally. I'm saying finally because we had a brief exchange via chat, and she's awesome. Floor works as a DevRel program manager at Microsoft, and she is very active in the community with supporting Rails girls, supporting the Amsterdam Ruby community with meetups, and was also the co-organizer of Yuruko 2019, of which I am super sad to say that I wasn't able to attend because I was too late in booking the tickets. But I heard awesome things about that edition. And Rails Girls Netherlands. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Aris said that you missed the Yuruko 2019 edition. I mean, we're on a boat.
I know. I was talking about that edition with everyone I could. I was just too late at pressing the button twice. It was
I'm
really
sorry.
So the good part is that half of my team was still able to join you, so at least they enjoyed that edition and brought back awesome knowledge and experience. So thank you.
That's very cool. And I mean, it was not last week, but it was 2 weeks ago. We did another sort of no Ruko, we called it, which is of course a play on Yuruko, because this year edition, of course, couldn't take place because, well, reasons that we're in
reasons.
the world. But we still got to invite 12 speakers to share their stories, and you can all watch it on demand because it's on our YouTube channel on Ruby NL. So we still did a little bit because we missed it, like you miss it.
Exactly. Okay, then I'm definitely gonna go and take a look at it. Thank you so much for it. Would you like to start?
Absolutely, I would love to get started.
Then I'll leave the stage to you, and see you later. Bye, folks.
See you later. See you on the other side. So hello, everyone. It will just be my face that you'll be looking at. I don't have any slides because I don't think they add anything to what I want to discuss with you. But I will post a blog post after my talk, so you can find all of the links and the things that I sort of refer to in my talk, and look them up and read them on your own time. So my talk is called OSS to be defined, and I totally missed the opportunity to make a joke about like work in progress or a to-do joke in there. So I'll do better on that next time. So let's get started. Enterprises have embraced open source software, but their grip is suffocating. Business critical software is plagued by vulnerabilities because of maintainer drain. We're looking for more sustainable models and regaining control over what our code can be used for. Several initiatives are popping up left and right, questioning what the fork we're doing, like the folks behind the Hippocratic license and the ethical source movement. I would like in the next half hour or so to investigate that if the world indeed runs on open source, then how can we make sure that they can do so sustainably and reliably? So yes, my name is Floor, and thank you so much for the introduction. You mentioned a couple of initiatives that I'm involved in, but I do feel the need to add a little bit to that. So yes, I am a Rails Girls coach and organizer. Yes, I've organized a lot of Ruby type conferences, online and offline or hybrid. And I was also involved in the Rails Girls Summer of Code initiative. And sadly, that was discontinued when Travis and the Travis Foundation got acquired. I'm also an organizer for the DevOps Days and the DevOps Meetup in Amsterdam, and for Serverless Days, the conference, and also the Meetup. I think I just really love connecting people and ideas. And this is the moment, I think, where I drop the disclaimer that indeed I work for Microsoft as a Senior Developer Relations Program Manager. And Microsoft has a history with open source that hasn't always been very healthy or productive. Of course, since a change in leadership several years back, that started changing and people started getting the memo. But we still have a long way to go. And so we should probably get started. So maybe you'll remember Caleb Heartstock at RubyConf 2017. He once helped build software to identify humans by drone. And the work was just so interesting that he didn't stop to reflect on that his work could be used to pinpoint human targets for assassination. So now he regrets his choice, but it allowed him to understand how easy it is for us to sort of get so lost in the work because it's so interesting that you lose sight of the impact that it might have on others. So if you haven't yet, I strongly recommend you checking out Caleb's talk for RubyConf. For more recent examples, because 2017 in tech world is basically like decades ago, but last year GitHub, for instance, took down software that was vital infrastructure for opposition groups in Spain. And that shows us that no party or company should own access to open source. Many companies restrict access to their services to folks in countries like Syria by US's strong request. They mostly have their companies registered there, and that's why they listen. And some dropped access to their product without prior notice to the people to the end users. Several big companies, including GitHub, Microsoft, and Palantir have contracts with ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We've heard horrible stories about the dehumanizing practices of ICE. In fact, just Monday, a whistleblower's report on behalf of a nurse at an ICE detention center reads jarring medical neglect within the facility, including a refusal to test detainees for the coronavirus, and a high number of hysterectomies being performed on immigrant women. In 2019, a $100K contract between software automation company Chef and ICE was uncovered as well. And after finding out about the contract, Seth Fargo, a former Chef employee and author of several related open source libraries, deleted his code in protest. I guess he did not feel very neutral about ICE's practices. He wanted to gain control again over what his code was used for. Pulling his code from GitHub, he more or less instantly discontinued Chef's offerings. Of course, this is a temporary measure, as the nature of open source means that one only needs to sort of pull the archives of his code to restore all the lost functionality. And legally, there's nothing Seth can do to prevent this. He licensed his code as open source. In 2018, Amazon Web Services added Mongodb, an open source database project, to its product offering. Mongodb did not make any money from this addition. So the project changed its license in an attempt to require Amazon to open source the code for the rest of its services. A few months later, AWS unveiled Amazon Documentdb, a program eerily similar to Mongodb offering, but built with AWS code. MongoDB owners did not see any compensation, and the project's contributors watched the project shift towards a more proprietary license without consulting them first, without prior notice. AWS walked away with a proverbial bone. Then there are stories of NPM components being abandoned, critical pieces of internet infrastructure left unsupported because the maintainer can just not justify the time and energy spent on these projects anymore. A commonly used component turns into a single point of failure for a shockingly large part of the internet when this happens. And sometimes it's not even that complex a software, right? Sometimes it's just a one-liner, but because everybody depends on this, it's this single point of failure. An example of this is in March 2016, Azer Kohulu, and I probably pronounced his name wrong, and I'm so sorry. Published more than 250 of his modules from NPM because one of the modules was called Kik, and that attracted the attention of several lawyers working for the instant messaging app, Kik. The maintainer refused to change the name, and Kik's lawyers went to NPM's admins claiming brand infringement. They went to Azure and said, "Hey, you have to unpublish this, or you have to change the name." Sorry. And he furiously unpublished all of his NPM managed modules, and one of those was LeftPad, and thousands of projects, including Node and Babel, relied on it. Open source code shows up everywhere, from popular apps to military software. So what happens in open source affects the tech industry as a whole. What got us here? Well, what got us here is the assumption that open source requires no regulation. Since open source is inexhaustible, it would be wrong to place restrictions on who can access the code and who can contribute to code. But when you refuse to regulate communities, they tend to regulate themselves. I think any community leader would agree with me on that. And open source, as a result, operates on a set of shaky ideas. For instance, the idea that meritocracy is a good thing. The attitude has led to some indispensable software, like the Linux kernel, for sure. It powers operating systems around the world, but you didn't want to find yourself in that community for the longest time. The idea that tech is neutral is another one of those shaky ideas. Software is first and foremost meant to solve people's problems, so it's inherently political. Volunteerism is another founding idea. Open source contributors usually aren't paid for their work. And some contributors may add to projects as part of their day jobs, and some of them might even work for like an enterprise arm of an open source project, but they are rather the exception than the norm. And then there's also this notion that there's no better way to sort of pimp your resume than by listing your open source contributions. And of course, you're much more likely to choose like the sexy, new, fresh projects to list on your CV, not the critical infrastructure that we all rely on and yet take so much for granted. And then there is also the case of FOSS developers getting hired into companies, then advancing on the career ladder, and that's a major cause of maintainer drain. There's also this move fast and break things mentality made popular by Facebook and friends. There is value in process, or even design by committee, if you will, making sure that different perspectives are being included and considered. It's just not as exciting as the promise of foosball tables. Remember when open and free software was the way to undermine big corp and empower individuals with technology? To fix that darn printer yourself. Well, today open source is being transformed into a tool for consolidating power. Authoritarian government entities rely heavily on open source to power their ops. And large businesses extract far more value from open source than that they contribute back to it, if they contribute back at all. The free software movement was revolutionary. It gave users control over their programs, power over their programs, even after free software was rebranded as open source, because that sounded better in corporate ears. Freedom of use remained the central tenet. Some open source companies and project owners are scrambling for new source available licenses that protect their intellectual property from large competitors while still making their code shareable. And many maintainers find themselves in a split. They regret seeing their code used for unethical purpose, but because of the open source values they signed up for, they're unable to do anything about it except for watch their code be weaponized. Other maintainers just struggle to make ends meet, even if their labor creates immense and positive value for others. Open source, as defined by the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, is focused on what people can do with their code that is licensed as open source. Their very core definition of open source is the idea that everyone should be able to take advantage of open source software. Which, I mean, it sounds good, right? Like anyone can participate, everyone can benefit. But in the end, it's really rather the producer giving up certain rights. They can't put any conditions on who is allowed and who is not allowed to use their software. And honestly, they can't really put up a paywall either, because that would only mean that the people that receive the code are then permitted to redistribute that code for free. Plus, they're probably expected to do support, and nobody wants to do support. So what is in this definition of the OSI then? So when we read bullet point number 6 in the OSI definition is no discrimination against field of endeavor. And the text under that reads, the license must not restrict anyone from making use of the program in a specific field or endeavor. For example, it may not restrict the program from being used in a business or from being used for genetic research. And in case there was any confusion still after reading that, in OSI's FAQ, they say, can I stop evil people from using my program? ? No. The open source definition specifies that the open source licenses may not discriminate against persons or groups. And they even state, and I quote, giving everyone freedom means giving evil people freedom too. This kind of makes me think of Saron's RubyConf 2018 keynote, where the Code Newbie and Codeland conferences founder said, inclusion makes it sound like you want everyone in your community, but you really don't. There are some people that you want to keep out, the bad apples, and when you're really disgustingly, aggressively nice to people, they don't want to sit with you. And maybe that's the solution. Maybe I've included that in my list of next steps at the end of this talk, but you'll have to just wait and see. So who stands to benefit? Big Corp derives massive value from open source, and they have every incentive to do so without contributing back. Effectively, they've outsourced labor to this sort of pool of unpaid developers. It's just smart business. But is it though? We've built a system that depends on the unpaid labor of thousands and with no real reasons for them to continue to maintain their software. So if and when they leave their project, that becomes a liability. Open source as an institution, and in fact, the OSI's focus on corporates prioritizes business over creators. Perhaps with good intentions, right? Maybe they wanted to professionalize the industry. But the expression goes that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Last week, I followed the OSI's online conference, State of the Source. And in his keynote, Joshua Simmons, the president of the Open Source Initiative, did mention several alternative licenses, but at the same time sort of brushed them off as being interesting experiments. I don't know about you, but when I say interesting, it mostly means like, yeah, whatever. Next topic. Ultimately, the gist of his monologue seems to be that businesses rely on the OSI for their policies, and the only way to navigate the current rough sea we're in is with a strong captain, the OSI, who continues steady course, meaning no changes. So what are the alternative licenses even that Joshua spoke of? So first off, he mentions the vaccine license, which is a joke, quite literally, because Bruce Perens, one of the founders of the open source movement in software, admitted to submitting that to the OSI without actually intending to support it. He wants to make a point. In the same breath, Joshua mentioned the anti-capitalist license and the Hippocratic license. And those are both honest attempts to regain some level of power over what our code is being used for. And I want to focus on the Hippocratic license and the ethical source movement a bit. Those are interesting, I think, in this context as well for Rubyday, as both are the result of the work of Coraline Ada Emke mostly. And she's a well-known Rubyist. She also created the Contributor Covenant, a document laying out the boundaries for acceptable behavior for open source projects and also for our events. and it has been adopted by hundreds of thousands of projects. I use it for almost all of my projects and online events. Also, did you know that Ruby on Rails was a driver for making popular the MIT license as the default license in the Ruby world, even though Mats is an avid supporter of the free software? In fact, DHH has been quite vocal about the need for change in open source. And he also said that he is worried that the affiliation with ICE tainted GitHub as an institution for open source. But I digress, because I wanted to talk about the Hippocratic license and ethical source movement. So the Hippocratic license is a software license that prohibits the use of programs for human rights abuses under the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, in its first form, the license was not ready or even intended to be adopted. Rather, Coraline, and now the team that joined her since, meant for it to be a lightning rod to start conversations about the intersection of software and social justice. The Ethical Source Working Group has now more than 150 members. The group worked with a legal team to legitimize the Hippocratic license and began to advocate for its adoption. It also put forth a 7-point definition of ethical source, of what ethical source actually is, which addresses issues like user safety and contributor compensation. The Hippocratic license goes against the OSI's definition of open source because it does restrict discrimination based on field of endeavor, like we just discussed. And it also goes against the Free Software Foundation's definition, which grants users the freedom to run the program as they wish for any purpose. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the ethical source definition. I, for one, am here for creators redefining what is and what isn't open source. Many developers want to know that their efforts are supporting projects that help their contributors and end users and not harm them. I, and many of you maybe, as casual contributors, have a choice in the projects we decide to spend our time on. And if anything, maybe the ethical source definition helps guide people and gives people criteria for evaluating projects that they might want to be spending their time on, want to get involved in. So if our institutions like the OSI and the Free Software Foundation don't want to support change in how people can use and reuse value created by the commons, and with corporates not having any incentive to change the status quo, what is left for us to do, for you and me? Well, I would first argue that it's not all that bad. I realize I've been kind of negative, but I want to turn it around right now. So in the Maintaineratie Berlin 2019 event report, and Maintaineratie is this series of events for the community of open source maintainers to gather and to discuss challenges together. If anything, it makes public that an awareness and a desire to change course. And you can read about the challenges that maintainers face, and hopefully we can all think about ways to mitigate those. And for how basic the OSI's State of the Source conference was, they did make quite the promise for the event, and that's something that we can hold them accountable for. So they promised, and I will quote again, to identify current non-technical issues affecting open source software, development, and communities through the lenses of developers, companies, and projects. And they promised to conceptualize and plan for what the future may hold for open source software as a community and the open source initiative as an organization. So I'd say in a week or so, let's ask them how they delivered on these goals for the conference, and if they have any documentation for this. Plus, they invited Toby Langel, who is a founder and principal of Unlock Open, who is involved in the OpenJS Foundation, among other organizations, and previously was a member of Facebook's open source and web standards team, as well as Facebook's representatives at W3C, and Don Goodman-Wilson to speak. And Don is an ex-GitHub DevRel and an independent consultant these days. So people not familiar with the ethical source movement still got to listen to two people that are in that movement. So, baby steps. And the last 2 days were actually, for me, evenings. I was involved in the Git Inclusion Summit. I worked together with folks from the Google Open Source Program Office, as well as Git contributors at Google, on this event for the 40 or so Git core contributors. That's a small but high impact group for affecting change to Git upstream, and hopefully also the projects that they are otherwise involved in. There are plans for a second event, larger and for a broader set of Git end users as well next year, to continue that conversation. Open source contributors are, I think, 95% male, and leadership is largely white. Open source's loosely structured governance and its expectation that contributors just have time to work for free has likely contributed to a very man-heavy and exclusive atmosphere. People joined the summit to find out where they might have perspective gaps and what solutions could work towards everyone potentially feeling welcome and included in the project. Open source has a reputation for being aggressive. And I think that connotation comes from projects like Linux and Git, where the communication style is aggressive. There's a lot of language that's maybe considered masculine. It's harsh, personal attack style code reviews, and those are still the norm. And like one of the participants of the summit mentioned, is the fish tends to rot from its head, right? From the head down. The Git project wants to commit to course correct, and shout out to them for trying. And I hope that the participants who work at the companies that pay them to work on Git bring their lessons learned back into the company and back into other projects. Actually, I would love to talk about maintainers a little more. According to the author and media studies professor Nathan Schneider, the cause of problems the OSS is in is governance. Open source communities are largely monarchical. There's one leader with no term limit. And beyond that, they're loosely organized. In the absence of official community structures, unofficial ones form, like we just discussed, and sometimes to the detriment of contributors. So last week, an article posted on the Stack Overflow blog talks about whether an open source project is best governed by an individual or by a committee. Many projects have thrived under a benevolent dictator for life, or BDFL for short, including Ruby, Python, Git. But of course, it isn't that binary, right? It's not either one strong leader or a committee. Some projects appoint a board through elections, or sometimes a board member is appointed by companies that sponsor the project. And having either a committee or a strong leader doesn't mean decisions are made transparently in either case. But if it were this binary, one of the risks you take when you rely on a central figure is that the project succeeds or fails based on the strength of the founder and their ability to manage a complex technical project, or even just to stay healthy and their situation around them to always stay the same, which allows them to continue to work on the project. On the flip side, a BDFL, as opposed to a string of leaders, can signal that a project has a strong vision and will continue the vision in the long term, which, if your values align with theirs, that could be a wonderful start of a beautiful love story. Drupal, Ruby, Python, they're all successful projects in large part because of that figurehead. But there's thousands of projects led by lone wolves that didn't make the cut. And sometimes the personality of the founder can be a problem. The rule goes, and I come from startups, and the rule goes that someone who founds a company or a project or an initiative isn't necessarily the best person for the longevity of that thing. So Guido van Rossum stepped down from the Python project not too long ago. Linus took a break after accusations of rude and aggressive behavior. I wonder where that come from. And DHH signaled very early that he had no interest in being Rails' bottleneck. So what can we do as casual contributors and end users of technology? I want to echo some of the things that Don mentioned in his State of the Source talk. And then I want to leave you with a couple of calls to action. And Don says, we must disincentivize the adoption of software by actors unwilling to commit to basic principles of the value of humans. Oppressive, authoritarian organizations do not deserve free access to our work, if that means that they will then limit the freedom to others. We must disincentivize extractive practices on maintainers. The people who create open source deserve to share in the value their effort creates. We must incentivize the creation of software which benefit outside of the developer community, outside of like another developer tool, but benefits at-risk populations. And we must incentivize a focus on outcomes and impact rather than just raw adoption rate. Raw adoption rate is a vanity metric, just like GitHub stars or anything. If our goal is to make the world a better place through software, then let's define what that looks like instead of, GitHub stars. So my call to actions, as promised, is put your contributions where your mouth is. I translated the Hippocratic license into Dutch, for instance, so it doesn't even need to be a code contribution either. I'll do a little plug, and I'm sorry, but at the end of October, I will organize another ROSConf. And ROSConf is Ruby Open Source Software Conference, which I started back in the day in 2015, which is a million years ago, and has had 3 chapters already. This one will be the 4th one. And we invite a number of maintainers over to talk about their project, and the vision for their project and what contributions they're welcoming. And then the rest of the day will be spent with the maintainers, with the participants to work on those issues. We ask the maintainers to triage their issues beforehand and maybe label them as first contribution friendly. And we limit the amount of people that can actually participate in the project to not overwhelm the maintainer. Because if you have more than 10 people working on your project at the same time, that's much. But we're trying to also invite those projects that we feel are vital infrastructure for the Ruby community, and projects that have adopted a code of conduct, have a proper contribution file, like the project that are maybe worth it. But you'll get an invitation for that, I'm sure. And that it's still in October means that you can still do those PRs in Hacktoberfest time, and you can claim that T-shirt. Or this year, actually, you can donate, and there's a tree planted in your name, so that's pretty cool as well. Another call to action is to support the software we all rely on through your wallet. So there's Ruby Together, for instance, a great grassroots initiative committed to supporting the critical Ruby infrastructure we all rely on. They support Bundler and Ruby Gems and other shared tools. There is a developer plan and there is a company plan. So maybe you can consider becoming a member, or asking your boss to become a member. There's also Ruby Central, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to Ruby support and the advocacy of the worldwide Ruby community. They organize the annual RubyConf and RailsConf, as we all know, and they support community growth. They provide vital infrastructure again, like, for instance, Ruby Gem. So Ruby Gems was started in 2014 as a project by the directors of Ruby Central, and a couple of friends, and has, of course, grown to this thing that we could not live without anymore. Voting with your or supporting with your wallet, you could use GitHub sponsors as well, for instance. Another call to action is to educate yourself and educate others. I can only recommend Don Goodman-Wilson's newsletter, The Ethical Technologist. It's a curated, commentated digest of the best content at the intersection of software and ethics. And I'm excited to find out if the Open Source in Business podcast should be in this list. Supposedly, it's a series and it's community organized virtual webinars created to explore the relationship between business and open source. And it should launch this month. Maybe it has already launched and I didn't check yet. And it will be sponsored by Red Hat. So that's interesting as well. Again, I will share this list of resources and further reading in a blog post later. I'm sorry, it will be a lot of links, and please don't read all of them because you'll, I don't know, like I don't know when you will come out on the other side, but they're well worth it. And then maybe start talking about this at your company lunch and learn. If you're a community leader, you can use your platform to advocate for more consideration, more empathy, and also practice through example. So Coraline and Toby both ran for a seat on the OSI board. They didn't make it, but sometimes I think the run is more important than the win. Except maybe when it's about American politics, then probably the win is more important. Maintainers could do worse than following the Mozilla Foundation's excellent resource, which is called Open Leadership Training Series. And again, I will share that link. And it will help you learn how to foster a healthy community. You can also connect to or find out whether your company, the company that you work for, has an OSPO, an open source program office, or a similar program. Or you could organize among yourselves. There are several Twitter accounts out there to follow and amplify, like the GitHubbers account or the We Won't Build It account that is led by concerned people that work at Amazon. For the Microsoft OSPO, for instance, I eagerly vote for the receiver of the FOSS fund, which is $10K every month. Anyone that contributes to open source outside of Microsoft's projects gets the ability to vote for the receiver of that fund. And you can also nominate projects. And this month I tried to nominate a project. And while there are many terms and conditions, like we can't support projects by Microsofties that are clearly led by Microsofties, which I guess is a good thing. There is no restriction for choosing the project that it needs to be not doing harm to others, or that it needs to have a code of conduct, or that it needs to have all of these things that make a project possibly like welcoming or not. So with that, if time allows, I'd like to ask you in the chat if you have any more suggestions on how we can support open source as a source for good again. And I might take some questions and I'll be around today. And you can also feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Drees on Twitter. So that should be pretty easy to find. And that blog post will come very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Floor. This has been, there's just so much to take, and the fact that
I'm sorry.
It's genuinely great. It's one for me, especially because I had this conversation a few times. I mean, as a product company, it's not exactly related to open source, but as a product company, we of course keep an eye on our users. And very often the question came up, was like, so how ethical are we in handling users' data, for example? So I think it's a great sign that we have so many opportunities out there for bringing forward the topic of ethics into our work on a daily basis, and in actually contributing in ways that are close to our hearts as developers, even. So it's not only theoretical talks, thing that is definitely important because it's a branch of philosophy and social science, but that we can actively do things. So it's a really, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We don't talk about this enough, in my opinion. So I had a question myself in the chat that was, in your daily work as a member, like as an employee in a company, what has worked in your experience for bringing these topics up without having the pushback, as oh, here it goes, the white knight or something like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I mean, it's something that I work on every day. So of course, like, Microsoft has a very bad rep when it comes to open source, but I don't feel like that's fair anymore. Leadership is really interested in these type of topics, and they're very open to discuss this. Our open source program office consists of wonderful people that are very receptive to feedback, and we also initiated a lot of these discussions around, for instance, changing the name of the default branch on GitHub. It's topics that are very important to us. Diversity and inclusion is incredibly important to Microsoft. I mean, even in our performance reviews, and we don't call them performance reviews, but it's the main question. What did you do for diversity and inclusion this last quarter, or however many times you have your performance review? And what do you plan to do in that regard for the upcoming time? So it's incredibly important, and feedback is well received. But of course, like, with a company as big as Microsoft, there are some people still around that are pre-Satya Nadella time, and they didn't get the memo yet. But that's fine. That's also not necessarily the people that you need to be talking to, right?
Correct. The wave will come.
Yeah, it will. They'll all retire at one point.
But I think it's a very good point that I mean, as managers ourselves, if we do stress the importance of this kind of contribution in the daily work of our employees, that will give that kind of signal that this is valued also by the company, and there you slowly change the tide here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. I was never a supporter of, like, the concept of baby steps, because I'm a very impatient person and I want the world to be fixed like yesterday. But I think I learned some appreciation for, like, small steps, and, like, every little, like, thing that we can sort of, like, build.
Yeah, there is an Italian say that is quiet
Rome,
waters.
I think also Rome wasn't built in one day, right? So, like,
there's that, definitely.
So that totally applies.
Millennia.
Super on brand, this.
Yes, definitely. So Flor, thank you so much. I hope you will enjoy the rest of your day. I look forward to talk to you again. Also on Twitter, you have a new follower out there. And since you were eager to have ta-da, there she is.
Pets. I should have my pet here.
She came right for your talk, and I'm not kidding. It's like, as soon as you started talking,
I understand. Open source is important.
Exactly. She knows. She's the manager. See you later, Flor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.